to today's webinar, a conversation about the troubling events in Ukraine. My name is Francesca Iacorto, and I'm a director of the Pearson Center. I'm also the Vice President of Communications and Advocacy at the Conference for Advanced Life Underwriting, CALU. I want to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the land of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We pay our respect to Indigenous peoples across Canada as well as to their ancestors for their immeasurable contributions to this country. As you may know, the Pearson Center, which is now 9 years old, is a progressive think tank that brings together a wide cross-section of Canadians from all political parties, business, labor, and civil society to address the challenging economic, social, and global issues of the day. As we like to say, we bring people and ideas together. Before we launch into today's program, I want to extend a very special thank you to all our donors and sponsors who make these events possible. We are very grateful for your contributions and hope that you will continue supporting the Pearson Center in the future. I also want to extend an invitation to those of you who would like this kind of event and for those individuals to visit our website at thepearsoncenter.ca and make a donation if you are able. That would be very much appreciated. Very briefly on the format, we will have a discussion with our special panelists for about 40 minutes, at which time we will turn the floor over to you, the audience, for questions. So please use the question box on your screen, and we will get to as many as we can before we end promptly at the top of the hour. Now, with respect to today's main event, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, obviously an extremely troubling event for the world over. We have two excellent experts to discuss this issue with us today. We have with us the Honourable Lloyd Axworthy, who is one of Canada's most notable former Ministers of Foreign Affairs, a post he held between 1996 and 2000. He's active in global affairs with an impressive network of current and former leaders and now serves as chair of the World Refugee and Migration Council. He has received the Pearson Peace Medal from the Governor-General of Canada, and I'm happy to tell you that he's also a founding board member of the Pearson Center. We also have with us today Yvon Baker, who is the Liberal MP for Etobicoke Centre and was the MPP for that area prior to being elected federally. He's currently the chair of the Canada-Ukraine Parliamentary Friendship Group. He recently introduced a bill, a private member's bill in the House of Commons, Bill C-204, to designate September as Ukrainian Heritage Month. He's also a past president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress of Ontario. And our moderator today will be none other than Andrew Cardozo, who is obviously the president of the Pearson Center and who also writes a regular column for the Hill Times. So on that note, I will turn things over to Andrew.
I'm not hearing you, Andrew.
Okay, let me start again. Sorry. Thank you to Francesca. Delighted everyone can join us on this very important issue. This year, I just want to tell you, is the 125th anniversary of Lester B. Pearson, his 125th birthday. And at the Pearson Center, we're marking it by looking at a lot of aspects of his legacy then and now. Certainly the discussion today very much deals with his legacy in terms of Canada's role in the world, the United Nations, multilateralism, world conflict, peacekeeping, de-escalation, all those issues that he was quite pivotal for in terms of both Canada's role and the United Nations. Incredible two people to join us. Thank you very much. Lloyd, you were, well, I want to, in order to have this discussion, I was trying to find a starting point. And of course, it would be fascinating to look at the whole history of Ukraine going back a long, long time. But I thought we could start in 1991. the independence of Ukraine, declared on October 24th, 1991, and the blossoming of democracy across Eastern Europe as the Soviet Union came to an end. Is that a good place to start to look at what's happened here 30 years later? Lloyd, I'll start with you.
Well, Andrew, again, thanks for the convening of this meeting and the chance to talk to the Yvon of Parliament about, because I think Parliament has a really important issue to play. I mean, this is something that really so many Canadians are engaged in, and I think their public representatives really have an important sort of responsibility to express that. So I'm glad we're having this discussion. On your specific question, let me answer it this way. In 2019, I was the head of the Canadian election observation mission, overseeing the presidential election in Ukraine at the time. I had been to Ukraine many times before in my former capacity as foreign minister and as a member of parliament. In fact, just as a little aside, I remember one of the first discussions I ever had was with the Ukrainian President Kuchma just after coming into power. And he said, do you have any advice? You live next to a very big, powerful nation. What would you suggest that we do? And I fell back on an old Manitoba saying, if you're going to negotiate with a porcupine, do it carefully. And I think that's been the watchword since then. But in 2019, I came away with an enormous sense of admiration and the way in which Ukrainians at that vote were using their vote to make a very clear statement that they wanted to be independent, they wanted to be democratic, and they wanted to really be able to express themselves. And I think we're seeing that today as they fight for their own rights. But at the same time, you can only feel the kind of overhanging cloud and shadow of Russia, even during that period. They were interfering in the media, cybersecurity, they were moving in on the eastern provinces. You just knew that there was a buildup. And since that time, of course, Putin has made this into a holy war of his own making. And I think what I want to say and answer your question is that there's now been a very strong and continuing demonstration by Ukrainian people through the power of the ballot box of what they want to do in terms of deciding their own fate, not to have it decide for them by some sort of isolated hermit in the Kremlin. And so I think that is our starting point in the discussion.
Yeah, Yvon, what are your thoughts on that question? And also, if you can share your thoughts on how Ukraine has grown as a democratic nation in the last 30 years.
Certainly, and Andrew, thank you very much to you and your team for having me, and it's an honor to be here on this panel with you, Mr. Axworthy. I've been a long-time admirer of yours as a student of politics and a student of government and foreign affairs. So I thank you for that. But also, I will add that I was on that 2019 mission that you referred to, and we had a chance to meet briefly. That election observation mission. So I thank you for your service to democracy in that particular context as well. I certainly agree with what Mr. Axworthy said. As far as the origins, I mean, you're really asking about where did this start, where are the origins, and I think there are so many factors we could point to, but I do think there's a few things. I mean, one is that Vladimir Putin has had, and he's written about this and spoken about this over the course of years, not just recently, what I would say is nostalgic ambitions to reestablish the Soviet Union.
Right.
And spoke about that in his recent speech before the invasion, but he's talked about that and distributed that message, that dogma, if you will, to his people and to his military quite deliberately. So I think that's one of the elements here. I think the other piece that's very important and that I think we have to wrestle with is, I think what's driven this to a great extent is the erosion of democracy in Russia. I think democracy holds leaders accountable, and to a great extent, and it forces a distribution of power that isn't in place in Russia. There isn't that accountability. Vladimir Putin controls the media. He controls the institutions of government. He controls the judiciary. We see Russians now who demonstrate against the war, who just unfurl a sign for peace, being immediately arrested. And so, as an example of that. And so he's really consolidated power, and I think that's a major factor in all of this. I don't think this would be possible in a truly democratic Russia. Because I think the people would not stand for it, the Russian people. And I think the last piece is the international community's response over the years to Russian action and to Vladimir Putin's actions. In 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea and then eastern Ukraine, they took the world did not do enough, in my view, whether it's in terms of sanctions or providing support to Ukraine, and there's other steps. So I think it's a combination of those factors, in addition to what Mr. Axworthy said, which is that Ukrainians want to be free and they want to be independent and democratic and part of Europe, and they voiced that in many ways very forcefully through elections, through the Euromaidan revolution a number of years ago, when they really revolted against a Moscow-backed autocrat who was their president. So I think there's a number of factors, and I think Vladimir Putin's threatened by that aspect that Mr. Axworthy spoke about as well.
Yeah, and Yvon, if you can just talk a little bit more about the Ukrainian nation. Putin is putting forward a view that they're not really a people, they're not really a country, a nation. But I think we've seen something quite the reverse of that, the opposite of that over the last, well, over time, but certainly over the last 30 years. Would you share that view?
So absolutely. I mean, if you study history, if you study the history of the region, the Ukrainian nation has existed for over 1,000 years. It is, in fact, the origins of what is the Ukrainian nation were there before Moscow was even, the city of Moscow, the town at the time, the settlement was even in existence. So nothing could be further from the truth. But I do think that that sort of propaganda that Vladimir Putin has tried to spread is he's had success in it, partly because he controls so many levers of communication like the media and the education system in Russia, but partly because that is a message that the Soviet regime used to also educate its citizens about and communicate through the media. So it's a recurring message from the leadership out of Moscow over the course of over a century. And so I think when people talk about the Ukrainian nation, you don't have to. We have a unique language, unique traditions, are very similar traditions, but nevertheless different. And so to suggest that Ukrainians are not a nation, nothing's further from the truth, and nothing's more, there are very few things more offensive and angering to Ukrainians than to be told that. That said, Ukrainians and Russians have lived side by side for those 1,000 years and for centuries. And to suggest that there's some sort of conflict between the peoples is nothing could be further from the truth there as well. And that's really important, I think, for people to take away. This is not a fight between the Ukrainian people and the Russian people. This is a fight between Vladimir Putin and the Ukrainian people.
Yeah. Lloyd, I wonder if I can take you back to the point you started to make was what Putin's up to. What are his objectives with Ukraine and elsewhere?
Well, I think Putin is changing almost daily. He has upped the ante from the time he talked about having to secure Russian borders against NATO expansion, which is an issue that I dealt with during '97 when NATO decided to move eastward. And there's always been various guardrails put on how far that expansion should go, what the limits were. The issue of Ukraine came up at that time to say that's a choice that Ukraine has to make, and it has to sort of be in a position to do it independently. So there was never any kind of grand design that the NATO would rush up to the Russian border immediately. And some things have happened, Andrew, since then that have exacerbated that paranoia that he's had. For example, when Donald Trump tore up the Intermediate Missile Treaty halfway through his tenure, what that basically gave license to is for both sides to have full freedom to employ tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. Well, the way Putin has interpreted that is that all of a sudden he's under the gun. Similarly, he's now in a position to put his neighbors under the same kind of nuclear threat as he's already doing. So I think that so Yvon is right. There's a kind of a basic root historical medieval sense that only an ex-KGB official could still hold on to. I mean, that's become dogma, religion, a basic fundamental faith. But the way he's interpreting it in the last 4 or 5 weeks, he's now gone from this is a security issue to this is an issue where we're in to liberate the Ukrainians from neo-fascists to now basically saying that we're going to obliterate any sense of Ukraine as a nation and take over its government and teach them how to be like Russian governments, which is quite a very repressive issue. What kind of intrigues me is why we're not doing more in terms of messaging to Russians. You know, the state controls the media. They don't control necessarily the social media. And we've seen Russia employ the most aggressive tactics in Ukraine itself and in Eastern Europe. In fact, in this country, in terms of trying to change the channels, mix the message. I think we should be getting back to Russians, not only about the economic squeeze they're under, but also that a lot of young Russian men and women are coming back injured, maimed, or in body bags. I don't think that's quite a full sense of knowledge that's there. We should be talking about how Russia has now become isolated in the world. It's become a pariah. The latest vote at the United Nations simply shows that even the southern global countries, which don't necessarily have direct skin in the game, are basically saying our basic principle is big powers do not have the right to sort of take over and assault and aggress their neighbors who are smaller and weaker. That's been a principle since 1945. It's a principle, by the way, that Canada over its years made a lot of effort at the UN to establish principles like the responsibility to protect, civilian protection, peacekeeping, things of that kind. So I think that there's a little bit of a packaging of messaging that our best experts in the cyber field need to be recruited and start putting that message back. And I think that would be perhaps one of the ways of containing or maybe even undermining Putin's control of Russia, because that's going to be one of the ways in which we try to bring this horrible assault to an end.
And you think we should be finding ways to communicate directly with the Russian people rather than?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, and in today's global digital virtual world, there's all kinds of ways of doing it. I mean, I'm the last one to pretend to be an expert. My wife Denise still has to help me turn on sort of a FaceTime or a Zoom, but the reality is that is that's a very important sort of communication is now an important weapon in this kind of battle. It is a battle for minds and hearts, and I think that Russians have to know the truth about what's going on.
Yeah. Yvon, do you want to add anything more in terms of what you see are Putin's objectives in what he's been up to for the past few months and what he's up to now with the invasion?
I will just say that I think a couple of things, as being someone who's watched Vladimir Putin very carefully over the past, since he came to power, really. One is I do think, like I said earlier, I think he has this desire to reestablish the Soviet Union. That's one element of one objective. But I think something that Mr. Axworthy said earlier that I just wanted to emphasize or underline was this. I think that Vladimir Putin is threatened by the idea that Ukrainians would choose a democratic path, one linked to Europe, whether formally or less formally, whether that's through NATO, whether that's through the EU, or whether that's through the stronger economic and cultural relationships. I think that's a threat to Vladimir Putin, because at the end of the day, what Vladimir Putin's done since he's come to power is he's consolidated power. He's enriched himself, he's enriched people around him. And first, one of his key objectives clearly has been to do that, to amass power and consolidate it. And so when Ukrainians who travel freely with Russia, Ukrainians have family members in Russia, who do business in Russia, who share the same media and social media, start demonstrating their linkages with Europe and that they want democracy and the benefits of that democracy, that is a threat to a regime like Vladimir Putin and the people around him as well. So I think that's something that he wants to support for his own sake.
So let me be the devil's advocate and ask you this question, and you might find it offensive, but there is a view that says, given all of that, Ukraine should not have been poking the bear. They should have just not expressed an interest in joining the European Union. Should have just played it low, and Europe should have just said no. We won't take you into the European Union. What's your view about that?
Well, I couldn't disagree with that more. I mean, if you agree with my answer to your previous question, that Putin's objectives are to recreate the Soviet Union and to consolidate power and enrich those around him, which he clearly has demonstrated have been objectives up until now in his time as president, then I don't see how how it would be that how Ukraine could choose a path that would not threaten Vladimir Putin. What path would that be? The only path they could choose that would not threaten Vladimir Putin would be if they perhaps chose to become part of Russia voluntarily, or if they chose to, they didn't choose a democratic path, or if they chose not to have relationships with the Europeans and trade and enhance their quality of life. How could we ask any people in any country around the world to choose those paths? These are things that all of us strive for, and we should defend with everything we can. So I don't think that we angered Putin. I don't think the Ukrainians angered Putin because they wanted to be part. Perhaps they angered him, but I think Ukraine would have been under threat from Vladimir Putin regardless, because they were choosing a democratic path. Being part of the EU, being part of NATO, would have given them greater assurances that Vladimir Putin could not be successful in invading Ukraine. And unfortunately, we didn't move quickly enough on that, in my view.
Alan, if I could just make a footnote to what Yvon said. I think it points to something that was a degree of failure on the part of Western countries, in this case, particularly European countries. They dragged the puck on application for EU membership for Ukraine. They could have provided preliminary status, sort of associate status, brought them in as part of the economic exchange, step by step. But there was the kind of a little kind of a bureaucratic or official sort of requirement. You had to meet all 23 of these criteria before you could apply. And it was a mistake that we didn't move further in helping Ukraine to establish its foundations as an independent country. And that had a lot to do with the economic and also just the sheer association. And if they had been given that kind of associate status or preliminary status, they could have bucked into European development funds, which were hundreds of millions of euros to go and build infrastructure, schools, hospitals, and it would have also given them a lot more leverage and diplomatic access into Europe. Now, would it have made Putin unhappy? Yes, but it would also have helped Russia, because a prosperous Ukraine, which has had a lot of exchange with Russia itself, would have been part of a general sort of building of economic capability. But let's come back to one of the key points. You're dealing with a dictator, a messianic dictator, and you can try all the sort of normal issues. Andrew, when I was in government, I was an apostle of soft power. Let's negotiate. But the hard reality is he only understands hard containment. And I think that's got to be really the touchstone that we start using. Dictators, autocrats, kleptocrats, they only understand things, and that's money and power, and that combination of things. And that's why I think it's really important that we keep the pressure on.
Yeah, I find that the last comments you made, Lloyd, particularly interesting, because you were a disciple of soft power, and you've been anything but soft power about this conflict. And I think you make the point very strongly that we're dealing with an entity which is extremely troubling, if I can put that very gently. Yvon, if I can just ask you, what has the government of Canada and what have the world governments been doing so far in response, so to date?
Yeah, so the actions have been in a number of categories. I mean, if I could take a step back, I think the way, what I think the international community's tried to do is demonstrate to Vladimir, is do two major things. One is to prevent him from raising the money he needs to fund this war, so cut off the supply of resources to the war itself, but also to help him understand that, and I think this is what we have to strive for, this is what we will have to do, is that the costs of this invasion, the costs of further action on his part, exceed the benefits to him. And so we have to keep ratcheting up those costs as quickly as possible, in my view, to ensure that his calculus changes. And so the governments of the world have tried to do this in a number of ways. One is by helping the Ukrainian military defend itself through the provision of weapons and intelligence and other forms of military support. That imposes a cost on Vladimir Putin, because that means the Ukrainians can hold up a lot longer. That imposes a cost on obviously, in terms of, there's a human cost to that, obviously, but a political military one for Putin. The second thing is a range of sanctions, some of them targeting individual oligarchs who surround Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Putin himself and his cabinet. Some of the sanctions are targeting our broader economic sanctions. So, for example, Canada's banned all export permits to Russia. We're no longer importing their oil. There's a whole series of things there. And then there's some sanctions that are targeted at the financial system. So we've sanctioned the Central Bank of Russia. The allies incredibly agreed. No one thought this was possible about a week ago or a week and a half ago. Agreed unanimously to take certain Russian banks off of the SWIFT banking system, which allows banks to send money around the world. So these are some of the measures that they've taken in a very targeted way, and they're clearly biting. They're clearly having an effect. But we have to do more. In my view, we have to throw everything at this now. It'll save lives, and frankly, it gives us the best chance of peace, as well as protecting Ukraine and getting Putin to withdraw from Ukraine.
And what are some of the other things we can? Lloyd,
yeah, I'd like to bounce off Yvon's comments. There's no question. It's been a remarkable, unified effort right around the world, of which Canada's played an important part in terms of applying real economic and financial pressure. I would say there's one further step that would make even a strong incremental difference. Through our council, we've been pushing the idea of taking frozen assets, which is now taking place, but repositioning them to go back to the people who've been victimized by it. Senator Ratna Odavar has got second reading of a private bill in the Senate to basically provide legislation that would give the Canadian government the right to transfer to the federal courts the opportunity to examine frozen assets. Abramovich has all kinds of billions of dollars of assets in Canada. If they're going to be frozen, rather than having them sit in a bank moldy, let's put them to work for the people who are really paying the price of their efforts. And I would make a case, Yvon, to you and your colleagues. I mean, a bill comparable or parallel to what Senator Odavar has in the House of Commons, within 2 weeks, we could lead the world in establishing not just freezing assets, but repurposing to the people who have been deeply victimized by it. And I think the second place where we need to up our game is on the whole issue of refugees. The government made some announcements today about trying to get a fast track on immigration visas. It's a useful step, but it's not nearly enough to take care of not only the enormous numbers that are now being predicted by the UN, close to 4 to 5 million refugees.
Yeah.
So two things need to happen, three things actually. First, I think we have to provide an awful lot more support for the host countries themselves. I mean, Poland has already taken over 500,000 refugees. They're not poor countries, but they're not well-to-do countries. And I think the idea of sharing responsibility for that initial sort of reception is very important. I think the Minister of International Development's put $100 million humanitarian aside. How much of it is actually going to go to support the continuation and the security of refugees? But more importantly, what's happening in Ukraine now, and what really, two things need to be addressed. One, as Russia tries to take over cities, Putin has made clear, and some of his field generals, they're out to obliterate certain people in Ukraine, the government, the teachers, the lawyers, the judges, the human rights activists. And as we know, if you get torn up in the Russian net, you'll never be seen again. And I think we have to provide a lifeline for those people, either by some form of lift and a direct transfer into Canada so they can be protected before they are extinguished. And along with that, one of the real concerns I think many of us who've been working in refugee have is that a lot of African students and Middle East students have been caught in Ukraine, and they're not getting the same access they should have. Our council recommended that the government of Canada establish a very large, we said, set a million target for refugee, but use all of the tools, not just immigration, but the Refugee Act, private sponsorships, being able to provide what we call prima facie designation. There's a whole series of tools that are not yet being used to relieve the pressure of refugees and to do it in a fair and equitable way. And the reason I point that out is because these are areas that Canada has credibility. I mean, in the refugee area, we're one of the few countries in the world that's respected for what we did with the Syrians. But we're not doing right now for the Ukrainians what we did for the Syrians. Now, maybe there's a rationale inside. I know there's people who have security concerns. But my answer to that is that you can deal with security concerns by doing the vetting when people arrive, and you do the kind of assembly here. But to continue to have a requirement for a visa at the border is really sort of putting it much too fine a string and vetting process. And at the same time, I think we need to, thirdly, that was my third point I made, I think because we have credibility as a country, we should be really working the diplomatic corridors to get a much broader, coordinated, cooperative, international approach. So that every country is now making its own decisions, what it'll do, what it won't do. When I was immigration minister back in the 80s, and Mr. Trudeau, the other Mr. Trudeau's government, we were part of a 15-nation coordinating international committee that dealt with the refugees coming out of Indochina. And it worked extremely well. Everybody decided what they would do for resettlement, what they would do for investment. So I think there's some really interesting ideas that should still be put on the table. And with a prominent member of parliament from the government caucus, my invitation is there.
So Lloyd, just on the last point, you're saying that we should be playing a role internationally to get a number of other countries to open up to refugees as well, and share with them our knowledge about how to do that.
Well, share that knowledge, but also make sure that as the French or the Europeans and the Americans and others are talking about taking refugees in, that we're doing it in lockstep. We're doing it together, not doing a series of unilateral measures. So that there actually is a kind of that the sum is bigger than the parts. And I think what we're seeing on the economic financial side is the effectiveness of unified, coordinated actions on sanctions and financial restrictions. I think we need to do the same kind of unified approach on dealing with the refugee crisis.
Yeah. Yvon, a number of things on the table that Lloyd just put on the table. What are your thoughts? And you talked about throwing other things at Putin. What are the other steps you think Canada and the world can be taking at this point?
So, Axworthy, I really appreciate your suggestions. I was taking notes as you were speaking, and you can bet I'll be relaying all of this to the ministers responsible and my colleagues. In terms of the first suggestion, in terms of freezing the assets of the oligarchs, or taking the assets that are already frozen and then providing them using that funding, I 100% support that and agree. I think that's absolutely right. I was at a number of rallies over the last couple of weeks with Canadians who were rallying in support of Ukraine, and there were chants of freeze it and seize it was.
That's right. That's right.
That's right. But I think, and certainly I support that 100%, and we'll certainly take back your suggestion on that one for sure. And your point about refugees, and there were a number of points that you made in around the humanitarian response and refugees, but I support what you've said. I mean, I do agree 100% that there has to be an international response. It has to be coordinated. I take your point about how we could make the process quicker, so we can get people to Canada or the host countries more quickly, and do the security screening differently. So I appreciate that, and so I will take all of that back. But I support.
Thank you.
Are there other points?
This is Andrew. You've been into watching a brokering of negotiation on these issues.
Well, as we say at the Pearson Center, we bring people and ideas together, and we're very fortunate
Right,
often
right.
to get the right people together at the right time. Are there any other issues you think the world can be taken with regards to Putin, Yvon?
Absolutely. Look, to me, we either pay a small price now or we pay a much bigger price later. I think that's the reality.
I don't think people understand that quite yet across the world, but
absolutely, and I agree with that, Andrew, and I think we have to. It's incumbent on people like me who believe that, or especially leaders in public office in governments to explain that. But I say that because, look, Vladimir Putin's not going to stop at Ukraine if he's successful. God forbid he's successful. Yeah, he won't stop at Ukraine, and we know that because he's communicated that very publicly, that he wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union. But also we have to remember that, so we have to think about what threat that poses to Eastern Europe, to the rest of Europe. But also let's remember that Russia is Canada's neighbor to the north and has tried to lay claim to parts of the Canadian Arctic before. So if we allow Russia to invade Ukraine completely, or invade any part of Ukraine, frankly, successfully, and retain it, then think of the message that sends to Vladimir Putin with regards to Europe, with regards to the Canadian Arctic, and think about what message that sends to other countries who might try to bully their neighbors, either militarily or economically or both. This is a threat to the international rules-based order that really allows all of us as countries to live side by side in peace, to respect each other's boundaries and jurisdictions, and to allow people to elect leaders that move their interests forward. So that's why I think it's such a threat. As far as the cause, your question, Andrew, was really what more can we do? And my view is that, look, there are economic sanctions that I agree with what Mr. Axworthy said. It's so important that we act as a unit, as a group. The Allies act as a group, if possible, on sanctions, and we've been trying to do that. But certainly, there's still a tremendous amount of business being done with Russia, and in my view, it's really important that we stop that. I know that there will be costs. I appreciate that, but if we don't pay those costs today, and there's ways in which we can mitigate the impact on Canadians and on others in democratic countries of those things. But if we don't pay that cost today, then think about how much we'll be spending, how much of our security will be threatened, how many jobs will be at risk, the economic impact in the years to come of having Russia threaten our Arctic, threaten Europe, other countries perhaps threaten their neighbors. So the best option, in my view, of those two is pay the cost now to avoid, or pay the larger cost later. And I say we pay it now and we go hard on economic sanctions, the business that we're doing with Russia, the things that Mr. Axworthy was talking about in terms of the assets, and there's a few others.
You're very right about the Arctic. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I have a couple of points on that. One area that I think Canada's already taken a good step forward is on the issue of war crimes. What you're seeing now is a deliberate strategy to basically assault civilians, and that is a war crime. And Foreign Minister Joly a couple of days ago was the first foreign minister to respond to the request of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to start an investigation. I think that was a very, very important step that she took, because I think other countries then followed. But I think you could go even further steps. You just had a major General Assembly resolution. 141 countries voted against Russia, only 4 for it. The General Assembly has the authority or jurisdiction to recommend the Secretary General set up a tribunal for aggression in Ukraine. And that means that the issue of war crimes should be coming at it from different angles and from different perspectives. The value of that is the concept of the war crime is it holds individuals accountable. You're not talking in the abstract of Russia and Ukraine. You're talking about a Russian general, a foreign minister, a president, or even somebody on the front line. And if they know that they're likely to be investigated and potentially indicted as a war criminal, does that begin to change the tactics a little bit? I mean, this is one way to try to limit the damage that's being done in the lives of people in Ukraine right now. And I think that the sooner we can do that, and I think, again, Canada has the diplomatic capability. I mean, Bob Ray's doing a superb job at the UN representing our point of view. I think he could build on that General Assembly resolution and say, well, let's do some practical things. Let's establish a tribunal. Let's have the Secretary General have a special envoy looking into war crimes related issues. In other words, try to get the UN back on track. I mean, the Security Council right now, is a dead zone because of the veto. But the General Assembly is now taking some leadership, as it did, by the way, back in the Korean War. It's a lot of history, and I was around then. Probably you two weren't, but nevertheless, it was an important way in which other countries could contribute. And I think the idea of focusing and targeting war crimes and making that a full court press could have a real deterrent effect on the onslaught that's going on.
Yeah, really good point. Lloyd, any other thoughts about what the other international organizations can be doing? NATO and EU?
Yvon talked about the Arctic. As you know, again, the Arctic Council is a kind of unique multilateral body in the world. It's the only one that actually has sort of people themselves on it, not just diplomats or foreign ministers. The present chair of the Arctic Council is Russia. It's a rotating chairmanship. And Yvon's right. I mean, the idea that they would continue to preside over the Arctic Council at a critical time when that council is dealing with issues of sovereignty, issues of transportation, issues of potential security issues. I think Canada should be asking Russia publicly and formally to recuse itself from the chair of the council. It shouldn't be sitting as a chair of the Arctic Council when it's committing an aggression against a neighbor, because Yvon is quite right. That's precedent setting. And again, we could send a signal to the rest of the world that Russia's participation in so many sort of international organizations should be called into question as long as they continue this aggression.
Yeah, I just want to remind our audience that we're at the 45-minute mark, and we'll start questions in a couple of minutes. So if you've got questions, please send them in on the question box that we have. I have one question here, Yvon. I'll ask you this: is there a chance that the oligarchs will feel the pain of the sanctions and either to get rid of Putin or pull him back?
Well, I hope so, but I think it's going to require a combination of forces in addition to that. Just to be realistic, I think the pressure on the oligarchs is critical, and any kind of pressure we can apply on them is important. But I think Mr. Putin has, I suspect that he has anticipated these types of sanctions, and probably if he decided to invade, notwithstanding the risk of these sanctions, he may have insulated himself from that. So that alone may not be enough. We'll have to see how the oligarchs react. And let's remember that Vladimir Putin has a tremendous number of levers to control them as well and influence them as well. What I think has to happen is that, in combination with an impact on the Russian economy. And I hate to say this because the war is not with the Russian people, and I want to be very clear about that. It is not with the Russian people, but the Russian people. I mean, Mr. Axworthy was speaking about communication to the Russian people. I agree wholeheartedly. That's part of it, but there has to be an understanding to not just the oligarchs around Vladimir Putin, but to the Russian people that the Vladimir Putin's leadership cannot continue. And so there has to be, I think there has to be broader economic sanctions, some of the things that Mr. Axworthy talked about diplomatically. All those forces together, I think, impose costs that in the end need to be greater than the benefits to Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, can you say a few words about who the oligarchs are? It's not a concept we have in the West, so if you can just enlighten us a little bit about who they are, what their power base is, and their relationship to Putin.
Sure. I mean, the oligarchs are basically incredibly wealthy individuals. Mr. Axworthy will have an excellent answer. I can see him putting his hand up. So I'll just be brief, and I'll just say, but these are individuals who have incredible wealth. There's different classes of oligarchs, if you will, but they're basically billionaires, and they've amassed a tremendous amount of wealth. The average, they control a tremendous share of the Russian economy. And so they have the ability, and they are being enriched by decisions that Vladimir Putin makes to grant contracts, to offer tax breaks, to offer them protection from competition. There's a whole series of things that the regime has done to support the oligarchs, and the oligarchs in turn have done to support Vladimir Putin. So again, for them, the costs have to be so great that they realize that they're willing to take the risk of challenging Vladimir Putin, or at least not supporting him to the same degree. But those costs have to be significant for them to do that, because they are incredibly wealthy and well-resourced, and they get enriched by Vladimir Putin, and they may not want to walk away from that.
Yeah, Lloyd?
Andrew, I want to correct you in one sense. The oligarchs may not start just in Russia, but the West has become their playground, their investment, their recreation, and their residence. I mean, the amount of property owned in London is in the tens of billions of dollars. There are major investments in this country by what you call Russian oligarchs, but they own steel companies, they own investment firms, and I go back to the point I made earlier. If you freeze those assets, that means they go into a piggy bank. We have to take it out of the piggy bank and start using it, so those oligarchs don't use it anymore. Take all their big yachts and turn them into floating residences. Make them pay reparations back into Ukraine for the damage that's being done. I mean, I think it's the old axiom in politics, sort of go for the money. Well, I think we've taken a big step on the Magnitsky Act to freeze. Now we have to take the second step, is to make sure that those ill-begotten funds are transferred into positive, constructive purposes. I guess it's the Robin Hood theory of diplomacy.
Okay, thank you. I've got a number of questions coming in, so we're going to do kind of rapid fire here and give it your best shot. I've got a question on nuclear, the threat of nuclear war. How concerned are you about the threat of nuclear war? And do you agree with the proposition that a nuclear war cannot be won and must be avoided at all costs? I'll ask Yvon to start with that.
Sure.
I think we always have to be conscious, especially in a situation like this where we're in a conflict with a nuclear power, of that potential. But I would say this: standing up, if we don't stand up to Vladimir Putin now, that risk of nuclear war doesn't diminish. The risk exists because Vladimir Putin is making the decisions he's making and signaling that would consider using nuclear weapons. If he invades all of Ukraine and then is at the Polish border, or invades Poland and is at the German border, that nuclear risk exists as well. And so the reality is we have to be conscious of it. We have to do everything we can to avoid it. There are no winners in a nuclear war, in my view. But I don't think that should be a reason to not stand up to Vladimir Putin, do some of the things that Mr. Axworthy and has been talking about.
Lloyd, you got a quick thought on that heavy question?
Well, a quick thought is that it's awfully difficult to put the nuclear genie back in the bottle, but we can certainly try to put a stop on the bottle. And we've been through a period the last 10 years where all the efforts at controls, arms controls, nuclear controls, have been disbanded, both by Russians and by the Western countries. And frankly, Canada has not been at the table. We used to be probably the most active voice in the world for the nuclear rights of non-nuclear countries, because we were the first non-nuclear country. We realized that in 1945, we could have built our own nuclear bomb, but the Canadian government at the time and Parliament decided not to do it. So we became the first non-nuclear disarming country. That, to me, gives us a legacy and a responsibility to continue that. And there are moves right on now to set nuclear use of nuclear weapons as another war crime, as an act of aggression. And I think Canada should be at the table. And I think in a very practical way, we have to set up all kinds of early warning systems. Let's continue the rearming of both the Balkan, the Eastern European countries, and Ukraine. But let's also set up some safeguards by which efforts at nuclear use can be mitigated. And that means having, again, a much stronger international Atomic Energy Commission that gets the right for inspection and review and monitoring.
Okay, a couple of quick questions on tactics. I don't know if either of you will know this. Does Ukraine have an air force for the defense, or have they been crippled? I don't know if you know the status of the Ukrainian Air Force. Yvon, would you know that?
They have a very small Air Force. They're relying heavily on drones, on aerial drones and those sorts of things. They do have some planes and helicopters, but not even close to what, not even scratching the surface of what Russia has.
Yeah, I've seen those envoys.
You know, I was watching a U.S. general in one of the newscasts talking about this long convoy, and his mouth was watering, saying that with a couple of good C-8 F-18s or C-35s and a couple of attack helicopters, they could obliterate that within an hour. And so, I mean, the effort by the Russians to kind of amass this critical arsenal would be totally debilitating with some kind of error, and even with drones. But I think, again, that was an area that we as a West, and I'm using that in a corrective way, didn't do what we should have done, which is to give Ukraine that capacity.
Okay, Lloyd, could the United Nations resolution have gone further with regards to the issue of uniting for peace?
Yeah, I said earlier, I think that uniting for peace could have given it a certain real direct practical initiatives, such as setting up a tribunal, instructing the Secretary General to stop giving speeches and go out there and do something in terms of a clear monitoring of crimes, of assaults, of aggression. They could also be making strong, the General Assembly can't order state parties, but they can recommend. And they could be recommending a series of steps by UN parties. And to me, what was fascinating about that is that a very large, almost a total majority of countries from the global south voted against Russia. That is a huge diplomatic loss for them. And I think we have to continue using the UN to continue putting out there on the public stage at the United Nations what Russia's up to, and keep holding their feet to the fire, because they spend a lot of time trying to invest developing connections with all kinds of countries in Latin America and Africa and other areas. This just simply cuts them off again from that kind of strategy of extending their outreach. And by the way, I think it's this is totally off the top, but I think this move has also provided a certain degree of security for Taiwan. People were worried that the Chinese would look at the Russian model and say, well, now we can do it. If they're looking at the Russian model now, they realize that if they try it, they would be facing the same kind of blowback that the Ukrainian people are giving to the Russians.
Thanks, and that leads to the next question I have here. What do you see this event in the context of U.S.-China relations and rivalry?
Well,
Lloyd.
in my view, I'll just do it quickly. Yvon, respond. I think it's given the Americans a very big step up in their kind of so-called pivot to Asia. They now have a unified Europe. Europe's now going to take on a lot more responsibility for security in its own region. They can work together in terms of developing that same kind of unity in Asia, showing that in unity there is strength, to use the cliche. And I think in this case, as I just said, it really changes the dynamics of the China-Taiwan sort of disturbance that everybody was predicting was going to happen. I think the Chinese are much more sort of rational about these things. They don't rush into the jaws of the devil. And not only that, but there's more constraints of Xi Jinping. Part of the problem in Russia is that there was nobody around him that could restrain him. There was the Communist Party had nothing to say. The Duma had nothing to say. In China, there are institutional restraints that Xi Jinping and his group would have to be careful about. And now they have a lesson in front of them. And so I think that gives the U.S. a chance to start in a very constructive way, building that unified approach in Asia.
Yeah, a quick comment from you, Yvon, on the U.S.-China relationship.
I mean, I don't have much to add to what Mr. Axworthy said. I think that's absolutely right. But I do think also that we've realized, when we've looked at the sanctions, we've looked at the response from the international community to what Russia's done, to Russia's invasion here of Ukraine, and I think for me anyway, it's a reminder of the fact that we need to the extent that we don't have those relationships or that we don't have those ties that support peace and unity in the face of this sort of thing, that we need to really establish those, whether that's through official diplomatic channels like the UN and other things, or whether it's country to country. I really think that that's a priority, because it's not just about Vladimir Putin and Russia. We need to make sure that this sort of thing never doesn't happen elsewhere. And I think those relationships are so important for that reason.
Lloyd, one quick question for you. This is probably a yes or no question, but can a country be removed from the Security Council?
Not easily, but it's uncharted waters, and I think there should be serious investigation. One thing that could happen is that we should be working to restrict the use of the veto and make sure that the veto is not used to protect their own self-interest. They were given the right of the veto in return for not being an aggressor. They've now sort of fallen on that obligation. And with that, Andrew and Yvon and all, I'm going to have to say goodbye because I have another commitment at noon, and
okay, well, we're just done. So thank you very much. That was the last question for you. I have a closing question for Yvon, but if you need to go off the air, Lloyd, thank you very much. Yvon, before we go, thank you, Lloyd. Wonderful to have you here. And thanks for your leadership on these issues. Yvon, quick question for you. People want to donate and help the cause here. Where can people donate towards humanitarian or other assistance for Ukraine?
Yeah, so I would strongly recommend people who want to make a donation. There's an organization called the Canada-Ukraine Foundation. They have an appeal. They've had it in place for some time. The Canada-Ukraine Foundation has done tremendous amount of humanitarian work in Ukraine for years. They have relationships on the ground. Their cost base is very low relative to other charities who do similar work, and they do really, really excellent work. And we have to remember the humanitarian challenges here are both in Ukraine and also dealing with the things that we were talking about earlier in terms of what the humanitarian needs of the refugees. And they do both. So Canada-Ukraine Foundation, the way to access that is at cufoundation.ca, the letter C, the letter U, foundation.ca. And the other one is the Red Cross at redcross.ca. They also have an appeal in place, and either of those organizations do wonderful work.
Okay, before I just say goodbye to you, I just want to tell our audience we've got a couple of more webinars coming up this month, one on pharmacare and one on the growth of the isotopes sector in Canada. And in April, we've got our annual conference, which will be 10 webinars over the course of 3 weeks. We're looking at the new challenges facing Canada. We will come back to this issue of Ukraine during the conference in April. So, and we can hope things are at a better stage by then. But thank you for joining us today. Yvon, I want to thank you for the work you do in Parliament. In general, as a member of Parliament for Etobicoke Centre, you've been elected provincially and federally several times. You obviously do, your constituents think you do a good job. But I think at this critical time with regards to Ukraine, given your heritage, your understanding of Ukraine, it's awfully important the work you do. So thank you for that, and wish you the best, and lots of support for you. So thanks so much, and thank you to the audience for joining us.
Thank you.
All the best, Yvon.
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for watching.